Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you please take your seats at this time as the program will begin momentarily.
Choosing an appropriate method, of course, is one of the most difficult parts in your research design. And it's all about the purpose of your research. So you should ask yourself the question from the beginning, what is actually the purpose of your study, and then how to achieve this. So there are several components when you start to look at your research design, and you need to balance these parts. So of course you should start from your research questions. What is it you want to understand? And this is connected then to your conceptual framework. So in your conceptual framework, you link your research questions, your variables, your constraints, and also that leads to your implementation. So you have to understand, what are your independent variables? Is there something you're going to vary in your design? Do you have this clear idea what could make a difference? And then how do you measure this difference? So what are your dependent variables? And in a lot of cases, you get constraints and availability of access to data, for example, or you need to take into account the study context. Are you applying some, or you want to apply some differences in a current setting that cannot be modified because it's a running production line, or you have a learning process where you need to take into account ethical considerations, so you cannot simply make two variations of your product and give a disadvantage to some parts of your participants. So, and you need to balance these factors from your research questions in your conceptual framework. You need to consider ethical parts into your design and take them into account. So, linking back to the conceptual model and how these components are interlinked, of course, your purpose gives you a starting point for your research questions. And in your conceptual model, you specify the relationships between your independent variables, your dependent variables, how you measure them, if they are probably confounding variables, relationships between these variables. So the purpose and the conceptual model, this is a kind of iterative discourse and design process that shape your research questions. And when you have your research questions clear, of course, you need to take into account sampling procedures. Ethical considerations are all the way behind all these parts you see on this slide. And this then gives you a clear indication for the methods. But in a lot of cases, it's also a forward-backward process. So probably you decide for a specific sampling procedure, but then it becomes clear that this is not possible. So you need to go back to the drawing board, look at your research questions, choose a different sampling strategy or an alternative method. So take into account these different components when you look at your study design. And starting with a purpose, you can have some highlights or indicators that help you with that. So does your research want to test a hypothesis or a theory? Then you typically do kind of experiments, surveys, action research, or case studies. It depends on how broad your theory is. Or do you want to develop a theory? Then probably you have to start earlier with qualitative data, look into ethnography or more qualitative research methods or grounded theory for development. Or does your research just need to measure specific changes that happen? So you could design an experiment or a quasi-experiment. So you use quantitative methods when you look at the measurement part, which you can of course also do with qualitative methods. Does the research want to understand the situation? Then you have to embed yourself, understand the starting point, the context, contextual analysis, ethnographic approaches are a very good starting point here. And as soon as you implement interventions, of course, you can shape these interventions in more qualitative studies or mixed method approaches. And when you do want to measure the in a summative study, the difference and the effect of your interventions, you do an experiment. And as said before, in all of these cases, you should always think about, does the data give me the answer, or is it possible that I can get the answer from the data I collect, or probably do I need to go for a mixed method approach? So here you see a little bit kind of a decision tree. You find lots of these in much more detail in the literature if you want to dig into this. So if you want to collect qualitative data, one of the first questions then is, do you work with individuals or do you work with groups and aggregate the data? And then you already there, when you have decided you want to start with a qualitative data collection, do you work with like interviews, surveys or questionnaires with individuals, which gives you a variety of things you also can do online or face-to-face? Or you work with groups in focus groups or Delphi groups, and there are also other methods for the groups. So the decision between individuals and groups also has to do with the context. So how important is probably the social context you want to take into account, and so on. So now, let's say you came to the decision you start with quantitative data. So there you have to first take the decision, do you want to compare differences between groups or treatments? And then do you have two groups or do you have multiple groups? And dependent on that, you use different sampling strategies, you use different measurements and different statistics. Or do you want to probably understand the relationship between variables? And then you have to decide, do you have a single predictor variable? Do you have multiple predictor variables? And that leads to the type of data you want to collect. So the first question you ask yourself when you start with quantitative data is, do you want to compare differences between treatments or describe relationships between variables? And then, of course, do you have two or multiple variables? And do you have independent or dependent measures in your design? And this leads to a variety of designs that you can do, and of course also the type of data you can collect. So what scale of data do you want to collect? What kind of statistics do you want or need to apply to answer your research questions? Which brings us back to the research question and the conceptual framework. So especially considering also GDPR compliant collection of data and storage of data, you need to take into account that all the data you collect in studies or experiments needs to be essential to answer your research questions. It's not ethical in that sense to collect data just for storage or probably for later use. You have a clear research question, you have a purpose of your research, and that is what you collect data for, to answer these. So, in summary, start with the main components, so build a logical relationship between the purpose, the research questions, your conceptual model with the variables, and specify these relationships between these components. And when you specify and look into these relationships, consider ethical aspects, of course, as a core part of your study design. So then you decide on what data collection you start with, and you look at the constraints also of these data collections. Constraints in the ethical sense, but also in the sense of the sampling strategy you can apply and considering the different variables in your conceptual model. Last but not least, consider and reflect on ethical considerations for data collection. Specify your data collection in advance related to your research questions. Specify your data storage in a data management plan, and specify your data analysis methods as far as possible. So best is you have all set up, also the data analysis pipeline and everything specified before, to clearly have a plan how you can answer your research questions with your study design and the data collected. Thank you.